is the Professor of Sociology at Bristol University and has been since 2001, and is one of the leading experts in the country on poverty, and has been directly involved in a large survey which she's going to tell you about in quite a lot of detail. And it's just great to have someone who's followed these things through. She's one of the key thinkers around social policy and how we actually think through how we are as a society, and it's just great to have her with us.
I want to start with a few figures from the Trussell Trust, which you're probably familiar with. The need for and the provision of food banks has grown very rapidly since 2008, since the start of the recession. But it's grown especially fast since 2010. These are just the forecasts of people fed by food banks affiliated to the Trussell Trust. And of course, not all food banks are so affiliated, but they give you a sense of the rate of change. And I was particularly interested by the fact that when I was looking at these figures in October, they were forecasting that in 2012-13, they would probably feed 200,000 people. And now they're forecasting that the figure for the year will be 290,000, which is nearly a third more than they were expecting in April. So this need has grown exponentially, more than tenfold in a period of 5 years. The second question is, well, who are the people who are using food banks? Well, many of you who are involved in food banks will know very well the kinds of people who are coming to you. But the Trussell Trust are very clear that a number of the people who are coming are not unemployed, very few of them are homeless, only about 3%. A very large number are people who are in work. And about a third are children. Many others are young adults. And others are coming because their benefits have been delayed, refused, or suspended. And one matter of some concern is that older people, pensioners, rarely use food banks, even though we know that there is quite some level of need among them. So that sounds like a high level of need and a very positive response from organisations, many of whom are affiliated to churches or to the Trussell Trust in one way or another. I have to say that this is the tip of an iceberg. These are the government's own poverty figures. They're probably a bit small for you to see. So I'll just say that, first of all, there's the line here is the people who are living at below 60% of the median income. Now, this is problematic, and I haven't used the 2011-12 figures, because median income has dropped, and so the poverty line has actually dropped since 2010. But even here, you can see that before housing costs, we have about 10 million people living in poverty. And if we look at people's resources after housing costs, over 13 million people living in poverty, of whom nearly 4% are nearly 4 million are children. Can you still hear? This 60% of the median is often criticised. We use it because it's a proxy measure, because the data is easy to get, and actually because the EU requires that we provide it. We won't actually have figures for 2012-13 until 2014, and we won't have figures for 2013-14, the year that we're just entering, until after the next election, so we won't know. The work that we have been doing is a UK-wide survey of poverty and social exclusion. It's called PSE UK. And what we look at is what this means directly for people's lives. It's a major survey, and fieldwork was done in 2012. So again, this does not and will not take into account the benefit changes that came in 2 weeks ago. It's one of a series of surveys called Breadline Britain, which began in 1983. And for Britain, as opposed to Northern Ireland, there have been 3 previous surveys in 1983, 1990, 1999, and now this one for 2012. The first one I was involved in was in 1999. And the 2012 one, we have just got the data. And the headline results were the basis of an ITV documentary on Maundy Thursday, which some of you may have seen. I'm not going to talk about the results in enormous detail, partly because we've only just got the data. We've only just started looking at what this data says. So we really only have some headline results. And I'm going to focus mainly on the issue of food poverty. But what is very important is that throughout all these surveys, the definition of poverty has been one which has included not just resources, but social inclusion. Before the word was part of our general lexicon, Peter Townsend in 1979 said, poverty is when people lack the resources to obtain the types of diet, participate in the activities, and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary or at least widely encouraged and approved. And this actually is something which the population as a whole do agree with, that poverty is, of course, a relative matter. Our survey has 2 stages. The first is an attitude survey, where we take a representative sample of the whole population. There were, in fact, something like 2,500 people in Britain and Northern Ireland altogether. And what we do is we give them a list of items. It's quite a long list. And we ask them to say whether these items are things that everyone should be able to afford, that are necessary to a minimum standard of living, or whether they're kind of just desirable or not even desirable. And only those items which more than 50% of people identify as necessities do we then count as necessities when we're doing the analysis of the data. So this is a consensual definition of poverty. And in fact, there is very little difference between sections of society on what people regard as necessities. There's very little variation by age, by income, by gender, by ethnicity. Most people actually take a very similar view. We then, having done that, we do a living standards survey. And for this, we interviewed over 5,000 households and everyone over 16 in each household, so we have more than 12,000 people. And this survey finds out who has and who doesn't have the identified necessities. We distinguish between people who say they don't have them because they don't want them. I mean, if they say they don't have them, we ask them whether they don't want them or whether they can't afford them. And then we leave out the people who say they haven't got them because they don't want them. Now, of course, that's a bit problematic because there's a thing called adaptive preference, which leads people, especially older people, to say that they don't want things when really they couldn't afford them even if they did want them. But just to get round the kind of argument that it's about, people are poor from choice, we then only consider the people who say they can't afford things. What we can say as a result of this is that, alarmingly, things seem to be worse than they were in 1983 at the depth of that recession. One of the very interesting things, though we did predict this, but it is actually very interesting, is that since 1999, there has been a tightening of attitudes. There are things which were regarded as necessities in all the previous surveys, which are not now regarded as necessary. But the sorts of examples of things that are fairly universally regarded as necessary are a damp-free home, 2 meals a day for adults or 3 meals a day for children, fresh fruit and veg daily for children, heating, warm coats, properly fitted shoes for children, and at the social level, celebrations on special occasions. But in all previous surveys, being able to give presents to family and friends once a year, birthdays and Christmas, has been considered a necessity. It no longer is. Having a small amount of money to spend on yourself or having a week's holiday away from home. In all the previous surveys, these have been regarded as necessities. Now the population doesn't regard them as such. Having friends or family round for a snack or drink once a month. This is the thing that Daily Mirror headlined in 1999 as now being poor means you can't afford to give a dinner party with a very middle-class image of people and lots of empty bottles of wine on the table, which wasn't quite the point. Or for children, being able to have friends round for tea and a snack once a fortnight. These both now fall below 50% for the first time. That is, they're no longer regarded as necessities. So we have become less generous. But even so, even with this tighter standard, the number of people falling below the standards of the day has doubled since 1983. And more children lead impoverished and restricted lives than in 1999. If we turn to food, well, Trussell Trust is feeding a little over 250,000 people. About 4 million people are not properly fed by today's standards, which again are less generous than earlier surveys. Well over 500,000 children live in families who can't afford to feed them properly, and over 3.5 million adults can't afford to eat properly. And having said that older people don't use food banks, single pensioner households, there are about 250,000 people who can't afford adequate food in single pensioner households, and about another 150 million in pensioner couple households. So that's about another 400,000 older people who can't afford to feed themselves properly. And we probably underestimate this because it's a household survey. And household surveys, by their very nature, don't include the very poorest people in our society. They don't include people who are homeless. They don't include, either the street homeless or people who are living in very temporary accommodation and moving around a lot, because household surveys tend not to pick up the very poorest people. So we should be very worried about the extent of food poverty. And looking at deprivation more widely, in 1983, 14% of households lacked 3 or more necessities, and 33% of households in 2012, that's a third of the population, lack 3 or more of the things that the population as a whole regard as necessary to a minimum standard of living. And the number of children going without at least 2 of the child necessities has doubled from 2 million to 4 million. So, if food banks are responding to this need, they're not actually able to deal with the extent of it. If food is good at the Home Workers' Cafe, the question is, why is this happening and what needs to change? Well, in the 1970s, the Roman Catholic Archbishop in Brazil and liberation theologian Dom Helder Camara said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. I'm very happy for you to call me a communist." The reasons for increasing food poverty are multiple. First of all, we all know there's been a rise in living costs, and particularly in the costs of food and fuel. The poorest 10% of households spend nearly a quarter of their income on food. Retired households spend about 11%, and that's all retired households, including very wealthy ones. So again, you will get a kind of distribution, but that's the top 10% spend just 4% of their income on food. And so rising food prices hit the poorest people hardest. Similarly, that is true of rising fuel prices. We have falling real wages. A lot of people, therefore, get into debt. There are payday loans, loan sharks, doorstep lenders. There was a lot of stuff about loan sharking in the 1983 depression as well, I well remember. And of course, there's a problem of unemployment. But all of those people can sort of, as it were, pretend they're natural events, though of course they're not. But above all, what has happened since 2008 and what has happened since 2010 is a change in government policy, one which has reduced benefit levels, reduced eligibility for benefits, and imposed benefit sanctions on people who fail to comply with conditions. Last year there was a BBC documentary by Paul Mason looking at the Coventry Food Bank, and they found that 43% of their clients were there because of benefit sanctions. People who have had their meals stopped because they haven't applied for quite enough jobs. Supposing the jobs were there to apply for, it's now possible for those sanctions to last for up to 3 years if the job centre sees fit. And in recent weeks we've also been seeing evidence that Job Seeker Plus officers have been given targets for sanctioning claimants. And the DWP denies that this is official policy, but it's plainly unofficial practice, whether or not it's official policy. So they're told they need to sanction 6% of claimants, irrespective of whether all the claimants are or are not actually meeting the conditions. If we look at just a few of those taxpayer and benefit changes, the freezing of public sector pay from 2010 to 2013, followed by a 1% cap, plus increases in pension contributions, mean that the real pay across the public sector has in some cases fallen by as much as 13%. So you will have people working in jobs that are necessary for the maintenance of society, experiencing huge drops in income. There's been increases in the number of hours needed for working tax credits. Working tax credits themselves were frozen and then subject to this 1% cap. We all know about the capacity for work test that has reduced access to the incapacity benefit. There's a lot of talk about protecting older people and how they've had an easy ride. We're being softened up for cuts in benefits for older people after the next election, if not before. Actually, this isn't true. The benefit rates for the state pension have held up better, although the inflation rate is higher for older people. But what has markedly happened has been a really enormous restriction in the eligibility. In 2010, women could get their pension at 60. By 2015, by the time of the next election, nobody, no women and no men will get their pension between 60, until they're 66. So that's a huge number of people who've been removed from eligibility for the state pension, and that's going to go on. So the reduction of funding of the state pension has focused, in a way like the disability, benefits, on restricting access rather than restricting the level. Mix of those happening for child benefits. We know that all working age benefits, including those for children who last time I looked weren't at working age, have been capped at 1%. Housing benefit caps, the bedroom tax, council tax benefits, and importantly, changes to the social fund, which are going to impact very markedly on the demand for food banks, because the social fund is essentially being abolished. And local authorities are going to have to refer people to food banks because they can't give them crisis loans. And so what's happening there is that people are being forced to rely on charity for the essential needs of life. That is the very condition that the welfare state was intended to prevent. The welfare state really says that as citizens, you are entitled to this basic standard of living. These benefit changes mean no, you're not, and that you must go to a food bank and be a supplicant for charity. What is going on is the deliberate destruction of the welfare state. And the Trussell Trust is rightly extremely wary of being positioned as an integral part of the welfare state, or rather a substitute for it. One of the consequences of the housing benefit changes is that the difference between poverty before housing costs and after housing costs will get greater. As people are forced to pay more for their housing, not just because of rising rents, but because of reduced subsidies, if they're deemed to be over-occupying, what that means is that more of their income will go into housing. And so the figures for poverty after housing costs will go up. In the light of all this, why is public opinion in favour, apparently, of cutting benefits? Well, maybe it won't be when people begin to see what's happening. I think we may be just on the cusp of seeing a bit of a shift there. But partly it's because of all this rhetoric about shirkers and workers and skivers and strivers, and the deliberate propagation of myths about poverty, which is that the poor have enormous family, they all live on benefits, they're all idle, they sit on the sofa all day. You can call these myths, you can call it misinformation, you can call it mendacity. And the report from the free churches that was launched over Easter, which is called The Lies We Tell Ourselves, has it about right. And Paul Morrison, in talking about this report, says that this is possible because we have a culture which allows us to tell lies in public life. So that's a very strong statement about what's going on there, from which I wouldn't dissent. And in relation to food banks, I see a few reasons to be cautious. One is that it's quite difficult, actually, to both, as it were, validate, approve of, welcome the efforts that people are putting into meeting this need at a local level, and the good-heartedness from which that comes. And to hold that in tension with realising that this absolutely shouldn't be necessary. So when the Untitled Chapter website says our vision is to have a food bank in every town, creating a nation where no one has to go hungry, I move into my utopian mode. I say, no, my vision is not to have a food bank in any town because we have created a nation where no one has to go hungry. And the language of opportunities for volunteering, well, you know, it's good that there should be opportunities for volunteering, very easily tips into a celebration of the growth of the food bank charity itself. Indeed, Trussell Trust got Charity of the Year award. And I'm very uncomfortable about this, as I am uncomfortable about the fact that there are gatekeepers who determine whether or not people merit a food parcel. And there are people in professional positions, there will be local authorities, doctors, ministers from any faiths. And they are determining which of our citizens may eat. And people are then limited to 3 food parcels. Now, one might say this is pragmatically necessary because it's not possible for food banks to feed all the hungry in the country. But Trussell Trust say this is to prevent dependency. This is a language I loathe. Poverty is not a behaviour. The problem is not the dependency of the poor. And part of the argument about this is that what food banks need to do is to point people to agencies to resolve the problems. But these problems are now endemic in the system. They're built into the benefits regime that has been created. So my last question was, is this just an inevitable fallout of austerity? It's 100 years this year since this horrible cartoon, the one on the left, was published. Let's all step down a rung. Well, you know, there's the problem about the gendering of all this. Actually, women have been hit much harder by all these cuts than men. And I also felt it necessary myself to insert a small amendment to it and suggest that we occupy. But we are plainly, equality of sacrifice is a bit of a joke. And it was in 1913, and it is today. And this is my last substantive slide. This, in a way, this slide is more important than any of the others. And I know you won't be able to read the figures, so I'll tell you what it shows you. It shows you the distribution of national income into the top 10%, the next 10% of the population, and so on. And it shows how that has changed since before the war, right up to 2009-10. I didn't go to 2010-11 because it's actually quite complicated to add a column to this in PowerPoint. But it hasn't changed very much. What you see here is that the share of income taken by the bottom third of the population, the bottom 30%, has been steadily falling. And that in particular, since 1979, it's dropped from 17% to 10%. And the share of the bottom 10% has dropped from 4% to 1%. So in relative terms, the poorest have been getting poorer and poorer. Now, 1979 is a good year to take, not just because it was the beginning of the Thatcher government, but because actually 1976 is the point at which this country was at its least unequal. But when we look at the share taken by the top 10%, in 1979 they had 21% of national income, and they now have actually gone down a bit. They now have about 30% of national income. And most of that increase in the top 10% has gone to the top 1%. Now, if I was a communist, I would say, I think we should just divide this all up equally so the top 10% should have 10% and so on. That is actually what I think. But if we simply were to restore the share of national income of the top 10% to what it was in 1979, when they were still loads richer than everybody else, and of course national income's got bigger, so they'd still have loads more money than they had in 1979. But that would actually free up about 10% of national income, with which we could lift every man, woman and child in this country out of poverty at a stroke, and reduce our class sizes and do many other things as well. So for me, the problem is not one of poverty of the poor, as the greatest poverty researcher and campaigner of the second half of the 20th century said, Peter Townsend, the problem is not the underclass, the problem is the overclass. And this is not an issue of charity, it is an issue of justice. So we need to think about what kinds of changes in our national and world systems would be needed to really make poverty history. That bus, as you can see, has broken down. And I just want to end, because I've overrun my time, I'm afraid, with some possible responses. Foodbanks, great sticking plaster. What is really needed is a political response, which we're beginning to get from the Church in the Bishop's letter and in the Free Churches report. I think in terms of the working poor, we need to be pushing for the campaign for a living wage. The food banks are a practical local response, but it seems to me very important that that response is framed as restorative justice, not as charity. And I was trying to think about other things that could be done at local level. I do think that in the face of the increasing poverty which we're going to see over the next year or so, that the local and national collection of evidence, both statistical in parish audits and people's stories in terms of their experiences, are things that it would be really useful to document at local level and represent to the public both at local and national level. But I'm hoping that other people may have other ideas of useful interventions to restore a modicum of social justice in our society. Thank you.
It's been a real challenge to us, and I hope it's given you some clear statistics, data and things like that, and some of the rest of the day now is going to unpack some of that, about what action do we take, how do we work, all those kind of things. Today we need to acknowledge that we're not all, there are many trusted food banks here, but there are also a lot of independent food banks, and one of the purposes of today is to learn from each other, and we're going to be doing that in the next few minutes.
And care ultimately is what this is about. It's more than just nutrition, it is care for the person. The cost of living in the countryside are significantly higher than those in the town, and there are those who, as a result, struggle, whether they are on low rural wages or seasonal incomes. So countryside, town and city, wherever you are, there is need. And if the state is not providing, food banks may.
And I would like to suggest that we are called not only to pastoral care, but also to what I would call prophetic ministry. The prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, which are our Old Testament, of course, are those who literally speak. They speak out in the face of fragmentation and oppression. They read the signs of the times and they speak in favour of the weak and vulnerable. They ask not just for care, but they ask for justice, for righteousness.
We've now become the Northern Devon Food Bank, covering an area of about 800 square miles. In order to cope with that, we've set our distribution centres up as independent branches in their own right, across, at the moment, Bideford, Barnstaple and South Malton, and some others in the pipeline. And those branches operate almost like food banks themselves, but they draw on the central administration for support, and it also gives us the opportunity of having central warehousing so that we can transfer food around the area efficiently. The other advantage that is transpiring from that is support that we're getting from some of the schools and colleges, where we're able to use their special needs students are being offered to us to get food out into rural areas, which is a major problem in Northern Devon, is distribution. And they say, you know, they have the students and the facilities, they need to occupy the students and the facilities, and this is a way that they can give those students focus and service the community as well.
Although we have the normal 3-week run, we've had to extend it to 7-8 weeks because of benefit changes, people that are in poverty, and we're finding it very, very difficult with people who their circumstances are not changed in 8 weeks anyway. They're still in trouble, they're still in financial trouble, and that is one of the greatest difficulties that we have.
One that I'm particularly interested in is our involvement with the credit union. We run 2 collection points for the credit union, and since Christmas we've seen our weekly takings drop virtually off a cliff. And I think this is down to the fact that people don't have sufficient money in their pocket to save. We're finding that they have problems paying off their loans. In some cases, even where we've restructured the debt, they are still having problems in paying. So there is a serious problem there. We run a job club, which is a relatively new venture, and the interesting thing is how the job club, which brings us obviously into contact with people who are on benefits and maybe from time to time get sanctioned, how that could fit in with running a food bank. There is a food bank in the town, but it's not running very efficiently at the moment. So we're hoping that we can revitalise that a little bit.
I've been really inspired by the different conversations and the information I've received, especially from Ruth Levitas. I think her presentation was very good, and it raised far more questions about how we as food banks can try and influence government and all the cuts that are being made and how it's impacting on local people. So I think there are so many people who are unaware of the poverty that is existing within their own groups. And how can we as churches and as good Christians donate food, distribute food, and get involved in it however we can in the best way that suits our abilities.
Just over a year ago, we were asked to provide some furniture as part of our project to a young woman who'd been homeless for many years but had been rehoused. So we went round to see her, to arrange to take a sofa to her. Prayed with her, invited her to church, which she was quite keen to do. She started coming to church. At that point she had a really severe drink problem, which was life-threatening, but she became part of the church family over the past year, got involved, was always at services, and just a few weeks ago we had the joy of seeing her getting married in our church to a lovely young man who also had overcome drink problems, and then they were baptised the next day, and it's been incredibly rewarding to see that journey that they have travelled, and just wanted to encourage you with that and what's happened through that.
I would say don't be surprised, meet the challenge, don't have too many boundaries, because someone will be lost outside of a remit.
Look at the community and adapt to the needs of the community, and then decide how you're going to set up a food bank.
There shouldn't be a need for a food bank, but if there is a need for a food bank, it's really good that we are actually joining together in lots of different ways to try and distribute food to people who actually need food through no fault of their own.
The job of a food bank is to put itself out of business.